Vince McMahon built a wrestling empire and put himself in front of its cameras for decades. And in that time, cameras have captured him in moments that range from bizarre to disturbing to outright damning. From sexualized on-screen segments with female talent to unscripted backstage outbursts to leaked body cam footage and allegations that blur the line between his on-screen villain and the man behind the curtain. The footage exists, and the internet has never forgotten it. So let's break down the Vince McMahon moments that were never supposed to see the light of day. On an episode of Monday Night Raw, in the build-up to WrestleMania X7, Vince McMahon stood in the center of the ring with Trish Stratus. This was not an ordinary segment. Stratus, who at the time was aligned with Vince's character in a storyline against his own son Shane McMahon, was made to do something that the live audience and the millions of viewers at home watched in disbelief. Trish Stratus was berated on an episode of Monday Night Raw and forced to strip down to her underwear and bark like a dog on her hands and knees. At the time, this was framed as part of the broader McMahon family saga heading into WrestleMania. Vince's character was supposed to be the worst boss imaginable, tyrannical, power-hungry, and sadistic. And the plan, in theory, was that his cruelty would get comeuppance. The low point was Vince making Trish strip to her underwear in the ring and crawl around barking like a dog. It did pay off with Vince getting his ass kicked by Shane and Linda, even Trish at WrestleMania, but still more than slightly off to see McMahon pushing a gorgeous woman to such extremes for heat. But the payoff doesn't erase the moment itself. The sight of a billionaire CEO publicly degrading one of his female employees, storyline or not, has aged in a way that no one involved could have fully anticipated. In one of the most criticized segments in WWE history, Vince McMahon forced Trish Stratus to crawl on all fours and bark like a dog in the middle of the ring. The degrading act, meant to assert McMahon's dominance during a storyline, was aired live and sparked immediate backlash. Though Stratus went on to have a celebrated career, the moment remains a painful reminder of WWE's past treatment of women and the extremes McMahon was willing to go to for shock value. The build-up to that moment on Raw was equally disturbing. Over the course of several weeks, Vince's character had established a relationship with Trish that grew increasingly inappropriate. What started as standard manager-client interactions devolved into something far more sinister. The storyline required Trish to play the role of a woman so desperate for success and approval that she would tolerate any humiliation McMahon threw at her, and McMahon threw plenty. And here is where the story gets even heavier. This was not a one-time deviation. This storyline from 2001 featured Vince McMahon cheating on his wife Linda, who was wheelchair confined in a catatonic state. At the time, it was seen as just another shocking plot twist, fitting right in with the soap opera-heavy storylines of the era. Revisiting the on-screen affair now, complete with elaborate makeout sessions between Vince and Trish in front of Linda. It isn't just uncomfortable, it's downright exploitative. The on-screen affair between Vince and Trish required multiple scripted kissing segments. These were broadcast on national television. His real wife Linda was written into the angle as a catatonic woman in a wheelchair, forced to witness her husband's betrayal in front of millions. Think about that for a moment. Vince didn't just blur the line between fiction and reality. He erased it entirely. He put members of his actual family into degrading fictional situations for entertainment, and the women involved had little room to say no. Week after week, viewers watched as Vince's character became more controlling and abusive toward Trish. The segments grew progressively more uncomfortable. The makeout sessions became more aggressive. The power dynamic became more explicit. And through it all, Linda sat in that wheelchair, supposedly catatonic, forced to play witness to her husband's on-screen infidelity. The cruelty of the storyline extended in every direction, toward Trish, toward Linda, and toward the audience being asked to accept this as entertainment. The barking segment represented the nadir of the entire angle. Vince stood over Trish in the ring, microphone in hand, berating her with language that would have gotten any other employer sued for workplace harassment. He demanded she get on her hands and knees. He demanded she bark. And when she hesitated, he threatened her, not with physical violence, but with something that in the context of WWE carried equal weight: professional destruction. The implication was clear. Do this or your career is over. The cameras captured every second of her humiliation. In the Netflix documentary Mr. McMahon, former WWE Women's Champion Trish Stratus addressed the culture of fear that surrounded creative decisions. There was a bit of concern amongst performers that if you didn't do what you were asked, that you would get punished. Stratus said, pointing to herself, "Sometimes, that single word carries decades of weight." The implication is clear. The consequences of refusal were real, and the camera kept rolling regardless. The sometimes acknowledgement is perhaps more damning than an outright confirmation would have been. It suggests a pattern of inconsistency, of never quite knowing when saying no would be accepted, and when it would result in punishment. That uncertainty is its own form of control. It meant that every performer had to calculate the risk every single time they were presented with something uncomfortable. And those calculations were being made by people whose livelihoods depended on staying in Vince McMahon's good graces. Trish did eventually get her revenge at WrestleMania X7. She slapped Vince. She helped orchestrate his comeuppance. The crowd erupted. The announcers sold it as a triumphant moment of empowerment. But the damage had already been done. The footage of her barking like a dog had already been broadcast. It had already been archived. And no amount of narrative payoff could erase the fact that a woman was made to degrade herself on national television. For the creative vision of the man who signed her paychecks, Trish Stratus was far from the only woman placed into compromising positions on camera by Vince McMahon. The Attitude Era and the Ruthless Aggression Era were littered with segments that, even by the standards of their time, pushed boundaries in ways that made people uneasy. Stacy Keibler, Candice Michelle, and Tori Wilson all found themselves in scripted situations with McMahon that have taken on a deeply unsettling tone in light of what has emerged in recent years. You've likely seen the meme created from this moment, a string of images showcasing Vince's shocked look of amazement as it intensifies with each passing one. It all stems from a segment in which Stacy Keibler was made to perform a seductive dance for Vince McMahon. This, naturally, was during an interview to see who would be his new personal assistant. The scene no doubt objectifies Keibler, placing her in a series of submissive positions next to her boss, both on-screen and in reality. It's part of a pattern of storylines that sexualized female performers for the benefit of McMahon's sexually charged character. In retrospect, it all echoes the alleged exploitative behavior behind the scenes. That famous meme, the one with Vince's eyes bulging wider and wider in escalating amazement, was born out of this SmackDown segment from 2002. What the internet turned into a humorous reaction image is, in context, footage of a wrestling company's CEO watching his young female employee perform a sexualized dance for him. Vince McMahon with a woman always spelled disaster during the early 2000s. Vince would infamously have segments where he had Stacy Keibler's legs wrapped around his head. She was trying to get a job as his assistant. Vince would kiss her despite being married to his wife Linda at the time. The Stacy Keibler segments followed a familiar formula. A beautiful young woman needed something from Vince McMahon. A contract, a job, an opportunity. And Vince, playing the role of the leering boss, would make it clear that his approval came with conditions. The conditions were never stated outright, but they were obvious to anyone watching. Perform, entertain him. Make yourself sexually available, at least in performance. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get what you came for. The assistant interview segment stretched across multiple episodes. Each week, a different woman would audition for the role, and each week, the audition would involve some form of sexualized performance. Stacy's turn came with the dancing. The camera angles were deliberate. Close-ups of her legs, lingering shots as she moved, and then, the money shot. Vince's face contorting through a series of increasingly exaggerated expressions of arousal and approval. Those frames became a meme. Millions of people have used that image to express shock or amazement, completely divorced from the context that it was captured during a segment where a boss was openly leering at an employee. Then came Candice Michelle. In 2006, WWE aired a storyline where Candice Michelle was portrayed as Vince McMahon's sex slave. This angle involved a plethora of suggestive scenes and implied sexual encounters between the two. At the time, it was viewed as somewhat edgy entertainment, albeit in bad taste. But, in light of recent real-world revelations, including damning accusations from Janelle Grant, where she alleges she was treated as a sexual slave for McMahon and his cronies, it's deeply unsettling. That word slave was used openly in a scripted television angle. It was presented as entertainment. It was filed under edgy storytelling. And years later, when a federal lawsuit would use nearly identical language to describe what a real woman allegedly endured, behind the closed doors of WWE headquarters, the audience was left with a sickening realization. What was on screen may not have been as fictional as anyone wanted to believe. The Candice Michelle storyline didn't just imply a sexual relationship. It explicitly framed her as property. Vince's character treated her as an object to be commanded, displayed, and used for his amusement. The segments featured her in revealing outfits, performing tasks designed to titillate the audience and emphasize her subservience. Commentary from announcers often reinforced the dynamic, making jokes about Vince's ownership of Candice and what that might entail when the cameras weren't rolling. The uncomfortable truth is that this wasn't played for shock or horror. It was played for laughs and cheap heat. The audience was supposed to boo Vince for being a dirty old man, but they were also supposed to be entertained by the spectacle of a powerful man exerting control over a young woman. The duality was always present in these storylines. Condemnation and consumption happening simultaneously. And the footage preserved both. And then there was Tori Wilson. In yet another controversial WWE storyline, Vince McMahon took part in some provocative segments with Tori Wilson, one of WWE's top female performers at the time. Vince convinced Tori to undress him, leading to a provocative moment where he disrobes, only for Vince's wife Linda to catch them in the act. With real-world stories of Vince McMahon's inappropriate behavior surfacing, scenes like this become disturbing evidence of his willingness to blur the lines between performance and reality, exploiting his position to engage in uncomfortable situations with female talent. The Tori Wilson angle followed the pattern established with Trish. Once again, Linda was written into the storyline. Once again, she was cast as the wronged wife. And once again, Vince's character was engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a woman young enough to be his daughter. The undressing scene was shot with all the production value of a primetime soap opera. Soft lighting, suggestive music. The camera lingering on every moment as Tori's hands moved toward Vince's clothing. Linda's entrance, the moment she caught them, was meant to be the climax of the segment. The shock, the betrayal, the drama, but watching it now, with the knowledge of what was allegedly happening behind the scenes, the entire sequence feels less like fiction and more like a confession broadcast to millions. Vince McMahon, the real man, was putting himself in storylines where Vince McMahon, the character, engaged in inappropriate relationships with young female employees. The line between the two was always thin. These segments erased it entirely. The common thread through all of these segments is unmistakable. A man in ultimate power, the one who signed every paycheck, who could end a career with one phone call, who decided who would be champion and who would be jobbing on the C shows, casting himself opposite women decades younger in overtly sexual scenarios, and every single one of these moments was caught on camera, broadcast to millions and archived forever. The footage was never supposed to become evidence, but the internet, time, and a federal lawsuit have turned it into exactly that. What makes these segments even more disturbing in retrospect is how normalized they were at the time. Wrestling forums discussed them. Critics pointed out the poor taste, but the segments kept airing. The storylines kept progressing, and Vince kept casting himself as the central figure in narratives that revolved around his sexual power over younger women. No one stopped him because no one could. He owned the company. He controlled creative. He decided what aired and what didn't. The cameras captured everything he wanted them to capture, and what he wanted was a documented record of scenarios that would later be described in a federal lawsuit as his real-world pattern of behavior. The N-word at Survivor Series. Backstage at Survivor Series 2005, the cameras were rolling on a segment that was, by all indications, fully planned. Vince McMahon was with John Cena, who at the time was deep into his rapping gimmick. And then Vince opened his mouth. One of the most tone-deaf moments of Vince McMahon's on-camera career occurred during a backstage segment with John Cena from Survivor Series 2005. Vince's fictional character of Mr. McMahon was asking Cena what was good in the hood before ending the exchange with a racial slur that we won't repeat in this video. During the backstage skit, Vince McMahon appeared alongside John Cena before telling him to keep it up and using a racial slur. The camera then cut to Booker T and Sharmell, who reacted with visible shock on screen. The segment was structured like a joke. Vince, playing the out-of-touch white billionaire, was attempting to connect with Cena's rapper persona by using language he clearly had no business using. The punchline was supposed to be Booker T's reaction. the cutting to him and his wife Charmel with expressions of disbelief, essentially serving as the audience surrogate. Look, the segment was saying, even we know that was inappropriate. Aren't we clever for acknowledging it? But the acknowledgement didn't make it acceptable. If anything, it made it worse. The segment wasn't Vince accidentally saying something offensive. It was Vince deliberately saying something offensive. Everyone involved knowing it was offensive, and the decision being made to air it anyway, because the shock value was deemed worth it. The script went through writers, it went through producers, it went through legal and standards and practices. And at every level, the decision was made to let Vince McMahon say what he said on national television. Now, defenders of the segment point out that the whole thing was pre-planned and that Booker T's reaction was scripted. It should be said that the entire segment was obviously pre-planned and agreed upon by all parties, including Booker T, whose reactionary exclamation of "tell me" he didn't just say that is clearly played up for laughs. However, the segment just doesn't play the same way in the present day. Devon Dudley has publicly called the segment disgusting for business, reflecting on how the moment made him and other black performers feel watching it. The fact that a billionaire from Connecticut felt comfortable enough to say what he said on camera, even under the protection of a character, is a moment that has become impossible to defend, regardless of context. It was broadcast, it was filmed, it was preserved, and now it serves as one of the most uncomfortable pieces of footage in the entire McMahon archive. Devon's comments revealed something that the scripted nature of the segment couldn't erase: the real-world impact on the performers who had to witness it. Whether Booker T agreed to play his part or not, the fact remains that black performers in the company had to watch their boss, their real boss, not just his character, use a racial slur on television. They had to pretend it was entertainment. They had to go along with the joke, and if they felt uncomfortable, they had very little recourse to express it, without risking their positions in the company. The deeper issue here is what the segment revealed about the creative environment of WWE under Vince McMahon's leadership. Mr. McMahon has done outlandish things during his career as an on-screen persona. But one moment people still bring up is the time he used a racial slur at Survivor Series 2005. He was hanging out backstage and speaking with Eric Bischoff and John Cena, and he was trying to sound hip because the latter was still in his rapper phase. A white billionaire from Connecticut who has rarely booked an African American to win the World Championship, said what he said to Cena. It is inappropriate to use that word in any context. The fact that nobody in the chain of command, producers, writers, standards, and practices, stopped this from reaching air says more about the culture of the company than the word itself. The segment exposed the power structure of WWE in brutal clarity. Vince McMahon could script himself to say anything, do anything, and portray anything, and there was no one in the company with the authority or the willingness to tell him no. Even if individual writers or producers had concerns, the final decision rested with Vince, and Vince decided that the segment was good TV. He decided that the controversy would be worth it. He decided that playing a character gave him license to say things that would have gotten any other public figure immediately canceled. What's particularly telling is how the segment was framed within the show's narrative. It wasn't presented as Vince McMahon, the out-of-control heel, finally going too far. It was presented as comedy. The musical cues were comedic. The editing was comedic. Booker T's reaction was shot and cut to emphasize humor, not genuine outrage. The entire production apparatus was designed to make the audience laugh at what they'd just witnessed, not recoil from it, and many did laugh. At the time, wrestling forums were full of comments defending the segment as edgy entertainment, as Vince being willing to push boundaries, as proof that WWE wasn't afraid of controversy. But other voices, particularly from black fans and industry observers, pointed out what should have been obvious. This wasn't boundary pushing. This was a powerful white man using his platform to say something he shouldn't say, insulating himself with the thinnest veneer of fictional character work, and suffering absolutely no consequences for it. The footage still exists. It's still on the network. It's still clipped and shared and discussed, and every time it resurfaces, the same debate plays out. Some defend it as a product of its time. Others condemn it as inexcusable regardless of era. But what's not up for debate is this. The segment was filmed, it was broadcast, and it remains part of the permanent record of who Vince McMahon chose to be when cameras were pointed at him. The Royal Rumble Quad Tear. In January 2005, The Royal Rumble match was coming to its climax. The plan was simple. Batista was supposed to eliminate John Cena and win the entire match. The execution, however, was anything but simple. The Royal Rumble 2005 ended with two back-to-back unscripted moments taking place. The original plan was for Batista to eliminate John Cena and win the whole thing. The ending was botched, though, and both Batista and Cena were eliminated together in the end. The botch itself wasn't particularly dramatic. Batista went to throw Cena over the top rope. Cena was supposed to take the bump and hit the floor, and Batista would stand tall as the winner. But the physics didn't quite work out. Both men tumbled over the top rope. Both men hit the floor at nearly the same time. And suddenly the finish to one of WWE's marquee annual events was in chaos. Referees swarmed. The announcers tried to cover. The crowd was confused. And somewhere backstage, Vince McMahon was watching the monitor and making a decision. In an era before instant communication with earpieces was standard, the fastest way to fix the situation was for Vince to get to the ring himself and give instructions in person. What followed was a moment that was never scripted, never planned, and never supposed to happen on live television. Vince McMahon came strutting down to the ring with a visibly frustrated look on his face. He rushed to the ring and immediately sat down as soon as he entered. What actually happened was that Vince McMahon tore both of his quads while rushing to the ring, and thus had to immediately sit down as soon as he entered the squared circle. The match was restarted, and Batista won the free-for-all without a hitch this time around. As for Vince McMahon, he somehow managed to leave the spot without any kind of assistance, despite both of his quads being destroyed. Both quadricep muscles at the same time. On live pay-per-view, the man's knees buckled the instant he slid under the bottom rope. And instead of showing any sign of pain or panic, he sat there, cross-legged, barking orders at the referees, as if he'd planned to deliver his instructions from the mat all along. The match was restarted. Batista got his win, and Vince sat there like a king holding court from his throne. Except his throne was a wrestling ring and both of his legs had just catastrophically failed. Medical professionals have pointed out how extraordinary the injury was. Tearing one quad is a devastating injury that typically requires immediate medical attention and surgical intervention. Tearing both quads simultaneously is an injury that should, by all accounts, make it physically impossible to stand. The muscles that allow you to extend your leg, to bear weight, to walk, they're simply no longer attached. They've detached from the bone. The structural integrity is gone. And yet Vince McMahon, after sitting through the restart of the match, after ensuring that the finish he wanted was executed properly, stood up. He didn't call for help. He didn't signal for a stretcher. He didn't allow anyone to assist him. He stood on two legs that had no functional quadricep muscles and made himself walk to the back. Every step was agony. You could see it in his gait, in the awkwardness of his movement, in the barely controlled grimace on his face. But he walked. The footage of him refusing assistance, dragging himself out of the ring, and leaving under his own power is one of the most unintentionally revealing windows into who Vince McMahon truly is. The man could not physically walk. His muscles had detached from the bone, and he still refused to let anyone see him appear weak. That footage was preserved on pay-per-view, and it has become one of the most replayed clips in wrestling history. Not because it was good television, but because it was a genuinely unscripted glimpse of the real Vince McMahon, caught on camera in a moment of raw stubbornness and physical agony. The aftermath became the stuff of legend within WWE. Vince was rushed to the hospital immediately after the show. He underwent surgery. He spent months in recovery, but the story that circulated among the locker room wasn't about his medical treatment or his rehabilitation. It was about the walk, the fact that he did it. The fact that he refused any help whatsoever. The fact that he would rather risk permanent damage to his legs than allow the audience to see him carried out of the arena. That mentality, that absolute refusal to show vulnerability, to admit weakness, to accept help even when the situation is medically catastrophic, defined Vince's approach to everything. It defined how he ran his company. It defined how he treated his body. It defined how he approached his public image. And it was all captured on camera during a moment when he had absolutely no control over the narrative. The cameras were live, the injury was real, and the footage exists as proof that the character of Mr. McMahon and the real Vince McMahon shared at least one trait: neither would ever, under any circumstances, show weakness. Jim Ross was not just any announcer. He was the voice of professional wrestling for an entire generation. Jim Ross is a legend in the professional wrestling industry, a once-in-a-lifetime announcer who's also been instrumental behind the scenes. His tenure with the WWE has seen some shaky moments, however, such as the instance where Vince McMahon would openly mock Ross's diagnosis of Bell's palsy. Live on the air. Bell's palsy is a medical condition that causes temporary weakness or paralysis. For Jim Ross, it manifested in facial drooping and difficulty controlling certain facial movements. It was a condition he dealt with publicly, with grace, while continuing to perform his duties as one of WWE's most valuable employees. And Vince McMahon decided to make it into a punchline. In 2012, Vince McMahon performed a segment on Monday Night Raw that crossed a line that most people, even in wrestling, considered sacred. Vince McMahon would do a segment on Monday Night Raw in 2012, where he did a gross impersonation of a longtime commentator for WWE, Jim Ross. McMahon would put on a cowboy hat and pull a face, making fun of Jim Ross' Bell's palsy condition. Multiple people would publicly state their distaste for the promo on Twitter. Former WCW announcer Mark Madden said, "McMahon mocking Ross's Bell's palsy was unforgivable." The segment aired during a period when Jim Ross had been removed from the announce table. Vince's character was explaining why JR wasn't calling matches anymore. And rather than offer a kayfabe explanation that honored Ross's contributions, Vince chose mockery. He put on an oversized cowboy hat, a reference to Ross's signature look. He contorted his face into an exaggerated expression meant to mimic the effects of Bell's palsy. And he spoke in a drawling, slurred voice, while the live crowd watched in a mixture of confusion and discomfort. This wasn't a heel getting heat by insulting a babyface. This wasn't a storyline designed to build to a satisfying payoff. This was the owner of the company publicly mocking an employee's medical condition on live television, and the fact that it was scripted, produced, and approved makes it infinitely worse than if it had been an off-the-cuff remark. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was horrifically nothing new, as the WCW character Oklahoma was also a direct parody of Ross. But Vince didn't stop there, unfortunately. McMahon also poked fun at Ross' real-life colon surgery in a WWE skit, alongside a character named Dr. Heine, and even made the celebrated announcer join Vince's not-so-esteemed Kiss My Ass Club. The Dr. Heine character was introduced specifically to humiliate Jim Ross. The premise was that JR was suffering from colon issues, a real medical condition that had required surgery and needed to see a doctor. Enter Dr. Heine, played by Jim Cornette, whose entire character existed to make jokes about anal examination and bowel problems. The segment featured JR bent over, the doctor making crude jokes, and the audience being asked to laugh at a man's genuine health struggles. The Kiss My Ass Club was perhaps the most degrading of all. Over the years, Vince had forced multiple wrestlers to literally kiss his bare ass in the ring as a form of humiliation. When it came time for Jim Ross to join the club, the segment was presented as the ultimate indignity. A man who had given decades of his life to making WWE's product the best it could be was made to get on his knees and kiss his boss's ass on national television. Think about this. A man who generated billions of dollars for Vince McMahon's company, who was the voice during the most profitable era in wrestling history, and Vince McMahon chose to make his real medical conditions, Bell's palsy, colon surgery, the punchlines of national television segments, and each time, the cameras were there. It was scripted, it was approved, it was broadcast. Jim Ross sat through all of it. Because in Vince's world, the show came first. Your dignity came second. And if your boss was the one writing the show, you had exactly zero say in the matter. The pattern became undeniable. Vince McMahon took someone who had been nothing but loyal, nothing but professional, nothing but excellent at his job, and repeatedly found ways to humiliate him on camera. And the humiliation wasn't based on fictional storylines or kayfabe heat. It was based on real medical conditions, real physical insecurities, real aspects of Jim Ross's life that had nothing to do with entertainment, and everything to do with cruelty. The Dr. Heine skit, the cowboy hat impression, the Kiss My Ass Club induction, these weren't organic moments. These were premeditated, scripted, and produced segments that went through WWE's entire creative pipeline and still made it to air. Vince McMahon approved them. Vince McMahon appeared in them, and the cameras captured every second of a man publicly humiliating someone who had given his life to making Vince's product the best it could be. Jim Ross has spoken about these segments in interviews over the years. Always with a measured tone that reflects his professionalism, he's acknowledged the hurt they caused. He's talked about feeling disrespected and undervalued, but he's also been careful never to burn bridges completely, because even after everything, he understood the reality of the wrestling business. Vince McMahon had the power. Jim Ross did not, and refusing to participate in these humiliating segments would have likely meant the end of his WWE career. That's the dynamic that made these segments particularly insidious. They weren't just Vince being a heel. They were Vince exercising his real-world power over an employee by forcing that employee into degrading fictional scenarios. And because it was all just a storyline, because it was all entertainment, Ross had no recourse. Complaining would make him seem like he couldn't take a joke. Refusing would make him seem difficult to work with. So he went along with it, and the cameras documented every moment of his humiliation. In June 2007, Vince McMahon did something that no other promoter in the history of professional wrestling had ever attempted. In 2007, after weeks of being shown as falling apart emotionally and mentally, Vince stepped into a limo that promptly exploded. What you would complete with video tributes and wrestlers in mourning. Many cited this as being in as poor taste as you can possibly get, as it aped the very real emotions following the deaths of Owen Hart and Eddie Guerrero. He staged his own death. On live television, Vince McMahon walked out of an arena, climbed into a limousine, and the vehicle erupted in a massive fireball. The segment was produced to look as real as possible. The following week, WWE aired a tribute show. Wrestlers spoke about Vince in the past tense. Tears appeared to be genuine. The audience was left wondering how far WWE was willing to take this charade. The build to the explosion had been weeks in the making. Vince's character was shown becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. He was feuding with everyone. He was making nonsensical decisions. His behavior was erratic. And then came the announcement that he was leaving the building, and the cameras followed him all the way to the parking lot. He climbed into the limo. The door closed. The camera held on the vehicle for a beat longer than normal. And then the explosion. The pyrotechnics were impressive. The fireball was genuinely large and startling. The camera shook. Commentary went silent, and then the feed cut to black. When Raw came back from commercial, the announcers were somber. They acknowledged what had just happened. They sold it as a real event. Vince McMahon, the chairman of WWE, had just been killed on live television. Stephanie and Shane were shown crying about it, and WWE would regularly have to state it was the character of McMahon that died, not the real guy. But of course, that didn't help matters. In the end, it blew up in Vince's face as much as the limo did. When the Chris Benoit tragedy occurred, and Vince realized there was no way in hell he could continue the charade. So he popped back up alive, claiming he faked his death just to get some reaction. And the whole angle was basically never mentioned again. The following week's episode of Raw was framed as a memorial show. The stage was decorated differently. The tone was muted. Wrestlers appeared in segments, talking about what Vince had meant to them, to the company, to the industry. Some of the testimonials were clearly scripted. Others felt genuine, with performers breaking from the planned talking points to express real emotion. And that was the problem. The angle exploited real grief. Owen Hart had died in a WWE ring in 1999, when a stunt went wrong and he fell to his death during a pay-per-view event. Eddie Guerrero had died in 2005 from heart failure. Both deaths had devastated the roster and the fan base. Both had resulted in genuine outpourings of grief. And here was Vince McMahon, less than 2 years after Guerrero's death, staging a fake death angle that required his employees to pretend to mourn him in ways that echoed how they'd mourned their real departed friends and colleagues. The Benoit tragedy, the murder-suicide involving Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel, happened days after the limo explosion angle. WWE had to scrap the entire storyline overnight. Vince appeared on the next episode of Raw, out of character, to address the real-life tragedy. The juxtaposition was horrifying. A company that had just spent a week pretending its chairman was dead was now forced to confront actual devastating death. The footage of the limo explosion, the tribute packages, the fake mourning, all of it was captured on camera and has lived on the internet ever since, as a monument to how far Vince McMahon would go for a storyline, and how spectacularly it could backfire. The decision to appear on Raw and address Benoit's death out of character meant that Vince had to acknowledge reality. He had to step out from behind the Mr. McMahon persona and speak as the real chairman of the company. And in doing so, he implicitly confirmed what everyone already knew. The limo explosion was fake. The death was fake. The grieving was fake. And now, when the company needed to address real death with the gravity and respect it deserved, the previous week's angle made everything feel cheap and exploitative. Vince never formally acknowledged the poor taste of the angle. There was no on-air apology. There was no statement taking responsibility for the misjudgment. The angle was simply dropped, erased from ongoing continuity, and WWE moved forward as if it had never happened. But the footage remains. The explosion is still archived. The tribute show is still available, and the entire debacle stands as proof that Vince McMahon's creative instincts, when left unchecked, could lead to decisions that even he would have to abandon when confronted with genuine tragedy. If the limo explosion was Vince's most tone-deaf storyline that actually aired, the incest angle was the one that nearly did. One of my storyline ideas was that Stephanie gets pregnant. Vince McMahon claimed on the Netflix documentary "I was the one who impregnated her. My character. I think it was something like that." It was like, no, that one didn't make it. This wasn't a vague brainstorm jotted on a napkin. This was a pitch that McMahon brought to his own daughter. That includes a time when Vince wanted to be the father of his own daughter's baby. In a WWE storyline, Stephanie was actually pregnant with Triple H's baby at the time, and Vince suggested to her that in WWE's world, they tell the fans that he was the father. Let that settle. His daughter was genuinely pregnant with her husband's child, and Vince McMahon pitched that the storyline should be that he, her father, was the one who impregnated her. It has been said that after it was rejected, Vince McMahon pitched for Shane McMahon to be the father instead. This seeming obsession with incest was rightly shot down, and thankfully never made it to their nationally televised wrestling program. The casual way Vince recounts the pitch in the Netflix documentary is almost as disturbing as the pitch itself. He smiles, he laughs, he treats it as just another creative idea that didn't make it past the filter, as if pitching an incest storyline involving his real daughter's real pregnancy is equivalent to suggesting a cage match or a title change. There's no apparent awareness of how deeply inappropriate the suggestion was. There's no acknowledgement of the position it put Stephanie in. Having to tell her father no, having to reject an idea that sexualized her in the most disturbing way possible. When Stephanie refused, Vince pivoted. He suggested Shane be the father instead, brother and sister, when that was also rejected. The idea morphed into the notorious No Mercy 2003 match, a street fight between Vince and Stephanie that took place just 6 days before her real-life wedding to Triple H. Stephanie said no to that too, and the way it's framed in the docuseries is the street fight between Vince and Stephanie was a reaction to that. The match took place at No Mercy 2003, just 6 days before Stephanie and Triple H got married, and to this day is still up there with one of the most uncomfortable matches ever seen. The I Quit match at No Mercy became Vince's compromise. If he couldn't have the incest storyline, he'd settle for a match where he could physically brutalize his daughter on pay-per-view. The match was violent. Stephanie took chair shots. She bled. She was thrown into ring posts and slammed onto the mat. And all of this happened with Vince McMahon, her real father, as her opponent. The match required them to be physically violent with each other, to sell hatred and rage, just days before Stephanie was supposed to walk down the aisle and get married. The psychology of that is staggering. Vince McMahon couldn't separate his role as a wrestling promoter from his role as a father. Or perhaps more accurately, he could separate them, but he chose not to. He chose to push his daughter into storylines that sexualized her, degraded her, and required her to perform violence with him. And when she refused the worst of his ideas, he settled for the next worst option and framed it as a reasonable compromise. The fact that this pitch was filmed during the Netflix documentary interviews, with Vince casually recounting the idea while smiling, is one of the most haunting pieces of footage in the entire series. With Netflix as the new Raw broadcast partner, there would be a lot of new, casual fans watching this. And seeing Vince smiling about this eerie father-daughter arc, and Stephanie wanting to duck the conversation, definitely makes the boss look twisted and demented. Stephanie does admit there were many arcs she disliked outside of this. Stephanie's body language in the documentary speaks volumes. When asked if there were storylines her father pitched that she refused, she said, "Yes, there were a couple. I'm not going to tell the one." She didn't have to. Her father told it for her, and the cameras caught every frame of his eerily cheerful recounting. The interview itself became a moment of unintentional revelation. Stephanie's discomfort is palpable. She's trying to navigate the question diplomatically, trying to acknowledge that there were boundaries without specifying what those boundaries were. And then Vince, either oblivious to or uncaring about her discomfort, just blurts it out. He tells the incest storyline pitched to the camera. He laughs about it, and Stephanie sits there frozen as her father casually describes one of the most inappropriate creative suggestions in the history of professional wrestling. This is what the cameras captured. A man who cannot understand why his daughter didn't want to participate in a storyline where he impregnated her. A man who views his family members as characters to be deployed in whatever narrative he deems entertaining, regardless of the real-world implications. A man who, even years later, can recount the pitch with amusement rather than shame. And all of it was filmed, preserved and included in a documentary that millions would watch. Not every moment that was never supposed to be filmed happens inside an arena. On July 24, 2025, police dashcam and bodycam footage captured something entirely different. Police released new video showing former WWE chairman Vince McMahon speeding before crashing his 2024 Bentley Continental GT into another luxury car on a Connecticut highway. McMahon appeared to be followed by a state trooper in Westport moments ahead of the eventual collision. McMahon's vehicle reached speeds of more than 100 miles per hour, state police said. A trooper's dashcam video showed McMahon accelerating and then braking too late to avoid rear-ending a BMW. The car McMahon was driving then swerved into a guardrail and careened back across the highway. The dashcam footage begins several miles before the crash. The state trooper is following a Bentley that's moving significantly faster than surrounding traffic. The Bentley weaves between lanes. It accelerates. It closes the distance on other vehicles far too quickly. The trooper maintains pursuit. But before they can initiate a traffic stop, the inevitable happens. McMahon's Bentley closes on a BMW at over 100 miles per hour. He brakes, but not soon enough. The impact is severe. The BMW lurches forward. McMahon's Bentley swerves, overcorrects, clips the guardrail, and spins back across multiple lanes of highway traffic. It's a miracle that no other vehicles were involved. The Bentley comes to rest on the shoulder, damage visible across the front end. The airbags have deployed. Steam or smoke rises from the engine compartment. When the trooper finally reached the wrecked Bentley, the exchange was captured on bodycam. "I got my granddaughter's birthday," McMahon replied, explaining he was on his way to see her. The encounter was recorded on police bodycam video. The bodycam footage shows the trooper approaching the driver's side of the Bentley. The door opens and Vince McMahon emerges, visibly shaken but attempting to compose himself. He's older than he appears in most recent WWE footage. He moves stiffly, and when the trooper asks why he was driving so fast, McMahon's response is telling. He offers an excuse: his granddaughter's birthday, as if the justification is self-evident. As if being late to a family gathering is reasonable grounds for endangering lives on a public highway. The trooper remains professional, but the body cam captures the entire interaction. McMahon is cooperative but clearly frustrated. He's not accustomed to being held accountable by anyone, and the dynamic of being questioned by a state trooper who doesn't care about his status or his money is obvious in the footage. This is a man who spent decades controlling every interaction, every narrative, every camera angle. And here he is, on the side of a Connecticut highway, being documented by a camera he doesn't control, while a state employee asks him questions he can't refuse to answer. McMahon was cited for reckless driving and following too closely. In October, a state judge allowed him to enter a pretrial probation program that could erase the charges if he completes it successfully. He was also ordered to make a $1,000 charitable contribution. The dashcam footage shows a $300,000 Bentley weaving through traffic at triple-digit speeds. Airbags deployed, debris scattered, and the Bentley ended up heavily damaged on the shoulder. The BMW driver, Barbara Dolan, later shared her shock in interviews. She described the impact as intense and said she felt lucky to walk away without major injuries. McMahon also escaped serious harm, though he appeared shaken in the footage. Barbara Dolan's subsequent interviews added another dimension to the incident. She described being terrified in the moments after impact, unsure of the extent of her injuries, and then discovering that the man who just rear-ended her at over 100 miles per hour was Vince McMahon. The surrealism of that realization comes through in her recounting. She's a wrestling fan. She recognized him, and she had to reconcile the larger-than-life figure she'd seen on television with the elderly man who just crashed into her because he was driving recklessly on his way to a birthday party. The footage marks yet another public relations setback for McMahon, who has struggled to rehabilitate his image since stepping down from WWE in January 2024. And in a grim twist of fate, no serious injuries were reported in the July 24th crash, which happened the same day former professional wrestler Hulk Hogan died of a heart attack in Florida. This is footage Vince McMahon never wanted the public to see. A man who spent decades controlling every camera angle, every narrative, every piece of footage that bore his name, reduced to a dazed figure sitting in a wrecked luxury car, while a state trooper asks him why he was driving over 100 miles per hour. The contrast between the untouchable Mr. McMahon, who once controlled a billion-dollar empire, and the elderly man caught on body cam trying to explain away a reckless driving citation, is, perhaps, the most revealing footage of all. The body cam footage stripped away every layer of the persona Vince had spent a lifetime constructing. There was no entrance music, there was no pyrotechnics, there was no crowd chanting his name. There was just an old man who'd made a terrible decision and was now facing the consequences. The camera captured him at his most vulnerable and his most human, and the footage exists as a permanent record that Vince McMahon, for all his power and wealth and control, is ultimately subject to the same laws and the same physics as everyone else. Everything discussed so far, the sexualized segments, the degradation of female performers, the pattern of inserting himself into uncomfortable sexual storylines, takes on a fundamentally different meaning in the context of the Janelle Grant lawsuit. In January 2024, Vince McMahon, longtime owner of World Wrestling Entertainment, was alleged by Janelle Grant, a former WWE employee, to have sexually trafficked and assaulted her at WWE's corporate headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. The scandal, one of many sexual misconduct allegations surrounding McMahon, resulted in McMahon's resignation as executive chairman of TKO Group Holdings. On January 25, 2024, former WWE employee Janelle Grant filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut against WWE McMahon and former WWE head of talent relations John Laurinaitis, alleging that McMahon had sexually assaulted and trafficked her. Grant, a former paralegal who lived in the same apartment block as McMahon, was offered employment with WWE in 2019 after the death of her parents. During the course of her employment, Grant alleged that McMahon recruited individuals, most notably Laurinaitis, for the purpose of sexual relations with her. The allegations are staggering. Grant filed her lawsuit in January 2024, revealing details of allegations of abuse that included being forced to engage in sexual acts with McMahon in company offices with others nearby, and expectations that she would have sex or lose her job. The lawsuit paints a picture of systematic abuse enabled by McMahon's position of absolute power within WWE. Grant alleges that she was coerced into sexual encounters through a combination of professional pressure and explicit threats to her career. She describes being summoned to McMahon's office for what were ostensibly work meetings, only to be subjected to sexual demands. She alleges that McMahon made clear the expectations: comply or face professional consequences. The details in the lawsuit are graphic and disturbing. Grant alleges that McMahon shared explicit images and videos of her with other WWE employees. She alleges that he arranged for her to have sexual encounters with other men, including John Laurinaitis, for his own gratification. She alleges that the abuse occurred in WWE offices, in hotel rooms during company travel, and in other settings where McMahon's control over her employment made refusal feel impossible. And the most recent filings have only intensified the picture. Former WWE employee Janelle Grant, who in a lawsuit accused ex-leader Vince McMahon of sexual battery and trafficking during her time with the pro wrestling promotion from 2019 to 2022, filed a 40-page affidavit detailing more of her allegations. During the course of her employment, McMahon shared sexually explicit media with a world-famous athlete and former UFC heavyweight champion, who was identified by the Wall Street Journal as Brock Lesnar, to entice him to sign a new WWE contract, which the talent eventually signed. The affidavit expands the scope of the allegations beyond Grant's own experiences. It implicates other high-profile names. It describes a culture where Grant's abuse wasn't just tolerated, but was known to others within the company. The allegation involving Brock Lesnar, that McMahon used explicit content of Grant to entice a talent signing, suggests that Grant's degradation was treated as a commodity, a bargaining chip to be deployed in business negotiations. McMahon has denied all allegations. The complaint's outrageous claims of sexual abuse and coercion are pure fiction, plainly intended to garner publicity, and are flatly contradicted by plaintiff's own contemporaneous statements, McMahon said in an April 2024 filing. Contrary to plaintiff's false allegations, plaintiff and defendant engaged in a consensual relationship, during which defendant never coerced plaintiff into doing anything and never mistreated her in any way. McMahon's defense centers on consent. He argues that the relationship was consensual, that Grant was a willing participant, and that she's now reframing the encounters for financial or publicity-driven reasons. But the power dynamic inherent in the relationship undermines the consent argument. Grant was an employee. McMahon was the chairman of the company. The ability to consent freely is compromised when one party holds complete professional power over the other. But the legal filings tell a story that echoes what was broadcast on WWE TV for years. The on-screen sex slave angle with Candice Michelle, the seductive dances from Stacy Keibler, the undressing with Tori Wilson, the barking on all fours from Trish Stratus, allegations against Vince McMahon, and how he treats female employees have been around for decades. Many people point to how it was right in front of us that he degraded or treated the WWE's female talent as if they were sexual objects for entertainment. A fictional story broadcast on television, even if it is in extremely poor taste, is no conclusive proof of any wrongdoing. However, McMahon didn't do himself any favors by interjecting himself into these types of spicy storylines and angles. The parallel between the on-screen storylines and the allegations in the lawsuit is impossible to ignore. For years, Vince McMahon wrote and performed storylines where he, as a character, exerted sexual control over young female employees. He made them dance for him. He made them strip for him. He called one his sex slave. And now a federal lawsuit alleges that behind the scenes, Vince McMahon, the real man, was doing functionally the same things to a real employee. For decades, these moments were broadcast as entertainment. They were archived on the WWE network. They were clipped and shared across YouTube and social media. They were never supposed to be viewed as evidence of anything beyond bad taste. But the Janelle Grant lawsuit has reframed every single one of them. What once appeared as fictional storylines now appears, to many observers, as a man repeatedly broadcasting his darkest impulses in plain sight. While the cameras he controlled captured it all, the legal proceedings are ongoing. Discovery continues. More filings have been submitted, and with each new revelation, the archive of Vince McMahon's on-screen behavior takes on new meaning. Every segment where he degraded a woman, every storyline where he exerted sexual control, every moment where he blurred the line between Vince McMahon, the character, and Vince McMahon, the man. They all exist on film, and they're all being re-examined through the lens of what Grant alleges happened when the cameras weren't rolling. At the heart of every one of these moments is a question that the Netflix documentary Mr. McMahon wrestled with across 6 episodes. Where does the character end and the real man begin? Vince stands by the fact that the real Vince McMahon and the evil boss character of Mr. McMahon are completely different people. But the interviewees in Mr. McMahon almost universally allege that the character is no more than an exaggerated version of the man himself. The interviews have people like Stone Cold, Hulk Hogan, Stephanie, and Shane, admitting that Vince will show people what he wants them to see. But when all's said and done, there isn't much to separate his on-screen persona from the backstage version of Vince. Whether he's dad at home or Mr. McMahon at work, this is Vince. It negates Vince's words when he tries to say he's two different people. Stone Cold Steve Austin, who worked closely with Vince during the peak of the Attitude Era, describes Vince as someone who could never fully separate from the character. The competitiveness, the need for control, the willingness to humiliate others for entertainment value. All of it existed in both versions of Vince. Austin recounts stories of backstage interactions that mirrored on-screen dynamics, of Vince exerting his authority in ways that felt less like a boss managing employees, and more like Mr. McMahon manipulating pawns. Hulk Hogan, who had decades of history with Vince dating back to the 1980s, offers a similar assessment. He describes Vince as someone who sees life as a performance, who's always on, who can't turn off the instinct to work and manipulate and control. Hogan suggests that the Mr. McMahon character didn't require Vince to become someone else. It required him to turn up the volume on who he already was. Stephanie and Shane's contributions to the documentary are particularly revealing because they're navigating a complex relationship. They're his children, but they were also his employees. They saw him as dad and as boss, and the documentary captures their struggle to reconcile those two versions. They describe a man who demanded absolute loyalty, who punished perceived betrayals, who could be warm and supportive one moment and cold and vindictive the next. And they make clear that the ruthlessness of the Mr. McMahon character wasn't invented for TV. It was taken from life. In the very first episode of the documentary, Vince admits to the interviewer that he can't tell everything. This was shot in 2022, so he had no clue of what would transpire. A naive Vince made it clear these stories were too wild for the camera, so he had to keep them hidden. That admission, that there are stories he refuses to tell the camera, is perhaps the most chilling moment in the entire documentary, because it confirms what critics, former employees, and now federal lawsuits have alleged for years. There is footage and testimony out there that Vince McMahon never intended for anyone to see. The Montreal screw job, the racial slur, the degradation of women on live television, the sexualized storylines with his own employees, the body cam footage, the Netflix documentary he tried to buy back before it aired. McMahon attempted to purchase the documentary after getting worried about some of the footage, but Netflix declined to sell the project. The attempted buyback is significant. It confirms that Vince saw the documentary and realized how damaging it would be. He sat through the interviews. He saw the footage they'd assembled. He heard the testimonies from former employees. And he recognized that the narrative being constructed was not one he could control. So he tried to buy it back, to bury it, to ensure that this particular collection of moments would never see the light of day. Netflix refused, and the documentary aired to massive viewership. Every single one of these moments exists on film. They were captured by cameras that Vince McMahon either owned, authorized, or could not outrun. And now, as the Janelle Grant lawsuit continues to develop and public perception continues to shift, these moments, the ones that were never supposed to be filmed or never supposed to be viewed the way they're being viewed now, have become the most damning footage in wrestling history. The cameras that built Vince McMahon's empire are the same ones tearing down his legacy. Every segment where he degraded a woman is being re-examined. Every moment where he exerted power over employees is being recontextualized. Every storyline where he blurred the line between fiction and reality is being scrutinized for what it might reveal about the man behind the character. And the most damning aspect of all of this is that Vince did it to himself. He chose to put himself in these storylines. He chose to write himself into sexualized scenarios with young female employees. He chose to mock Jim Ross on camera. He chose to say a racial slur on national television. He chose to stage his own death. He chose to pitch an incest storyline. None of it was forced on him. None of it was required. He was the owner of the company. He had absolute creative control, and he chose to create and preserve footage that would eventually be used to illustrate a pattern of behavior alleged in a federal lawsuit. The line between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon was always thin, and the footage proves it. The cameras captured everything. And now, decades of moments that were supposed to be entertainment have become something else entirely. Evidence of who Vince McMahon really was, when he thought the cameras were showing the world exactly what he wanted them to see.